Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Yuma, welcome. My name is Beth Orton and I'm the Centre Manager at the Development Policy Centre, part of the Crawford School of Public Policy here at the Australian National University. We acknowledge and celebrate the first people on whose traditional lands we meet. Okay. I've got an echo going on. So everyone online's hearing me more than once. The joys of hybrid workshops. We're totally on top of it though, don't worry. Here are weird things. Thank goodness for Ari. Okay, let's start again. Good morning, Yuma, welcome. My name is Beth Orton. I'm the Centre Manager at the Development Policy Centre, part of the Crawford School of Public Policy here at Australian National University. We acknowledge and celebrate the first people on whose traditional lands we meet here at the Crawford School, the Nunavut and Ngambri people, and pay our respect to elders past and present. This workshop has been organised to coincide with a visit to Australia by international expert on migration and farm labour, Professor Philip Martin, from the Global Migration Centre at the University of California, Davis. Given Deb Poll's very keen focus on labour mobility programs, primarily between Pacific Island countries and Australia and New Zealand, we wanted to take this opportunity to compare labour mobility programs across 4 countries: the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. I'll be the MC for the first part of the workshop, and Professor Stephen Howes will MC for the second part after a break. Professor Martin will present US farm labour futures, and he will be followed via Zoom by Robert Falconer from the University of Calgary, who will discuss Canada's Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. Our first respondent, Manjula Luthria, Senior Economist from the World Bank, will provide her comments via Zoom on the first 2 presentations on the US and Canada, and then we'll take a short break. After the break, my Development Policy Centre colleagues, Dr. Charlotte Bedford, also on Zoom, and Dr. Richard Curtin, here in person, will present on the New Zealand and Australian labour mobility programs. Steve Burdett, Executive Officer, Approved Employers of Australia, Emma Buetti, President of the Pacific Islands Council of Queensland, and Taylor Rundle, somewhere, oh, there he is, great, National Economist at the Australian Workers' Union National Office will then respond. Due to our compressed schedule today, those in our in-person audience are welcome to ask questions to our presenters in the break and following the workshop during lunch. For those joining us online, and I think we've got quite a good crew of about 80 people, we ask you to submit your questions on the Zoom Q&A function, and the presenters will respond to you after the workshop via email. Before we begin our presentations, I would like to introduce Carli Shillito, Assistant Secretary, Pacific Labour Branch from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to deliver the opening address.
Fantastic. Thanks, Beth. And can I say congratulations on getting the pronunciation of my name right? It's a very rare thing, so you've done very well. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this really important discussion today, either here in Canberra or online. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining this meeting here today. As Beth mentioned already, my name is Carli Shillito. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Pacific Labor Policy and Engagement Branch at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I have responsibility for the policy, stakeholder and Pacific engagement aspects of the work that DFAT does on labour mobility. And it's a real pleasure to be here today to deliver this opening address. Before I begin though, I just want to advise that as a public servant, and given where we are at in the electoral cycle, I am bound by caretaker conventions. So I'll be limiting my comments today and my contribution today to sort of fairly factual matters and matters of administration. So I apologise in advance for being a boring public servant, but sometimes that's what's necessary. A huge thank you to the ANU Development Policy Centre for hosting us at the Crawford School of Public Policy today. And I really want to express my gratitude to Professor Stephen Howes and Beth, who have brought people from around the world together for today's workshop. Welcome to our overseas guests, including Professor Philip Martin, from the University of California, Davis, Robert Falconer from the University of Calgary, who's online, and Dev Policy Research Fellows Charlotte Bedford and Richard Curtin. I look forward to hearing what you have to say today. So we're here today to discuss seasonal labour mobility programs in Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the United States, and to consider what we can learn from the experiences of each. At DFAT, we're always really grateful for the insights of our counterparts in the labour mobility space, and I'm really looking forward to listening to your presentations and the discussions that they provoke today. Labour mobility is central to Australia's relationship with our Pacific neighbours and Timor-Leste. It provides much needed remittances to the Pacific and Timor-Leste, helps fill crucial labour gaps in Australia, and fosters greater people-to-people connections between our countries. Providing labour market access to workers from the Pacific and Timor-Leste creates the opportunity for workers to improve the living standards of their families, with those benefits spilling over into their communities at home. Currently, there are more than 23,000 Pacific and Timor-Leste people working in Australia under the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, or the PALM scheme. These workers fill critical gaps in our labour market where Australian workers are not available, including in agriculture, manufacturing, meat processing and the aged care sectors. Australia's Pacific labour programs are highly valued by all participating stakeholders. For those of you who follow this area closely, which is most of the people online today and in this room, a recent World Bank study found that 95% of seasonal workers surveyed wished to return for the following season, and many workers return to Australia annually, about 74% each year, often to the same employer with whom they've built strong relationships over a period of time. Because they are supporting families and communities in their home countries, the majority of workers under the PALM scheme are committed, reliable and more productive than other sources of temporary labour, working holiday visa holders, for example. The same World Bank survey that I mentioned earlier also showed strong support from these employers for the scheme, with 98% of them eager to welcome workers the following year. The number of approved employers under the scheme grows every year, and presently there are 378 of those working across all states and territories in Australia. Similarly, feedback from our Pacific and from our counterparts in the Pacific and Timor-Leste is overwhelmingly positive. Our partner governments acknowledge the benefits to their people and their economies from participation in the schemes, particularly over the past couple of years as they have weathered the economic hardships brought on by COVID-19. On average, seasonal workers send $1,061 per month home to their families, and longer term workers under the PALM scheme send on average $1,310 per month. Workers and their families commonly spend their income on their families and in their communities, paying for their children's education, setting up businesses and building new homes. Pacific and Timor-Leste workers played a key role in maintaining food security for Australia and financial viability for critical sectors during the COVID-19 pandemic. And emerging research from the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, or ACR, indicates that there is unprecedented agricultural skills and knowledge transfer to Pacific workers through their experiences on Australian farms. Labour mobility promotes circular farm labour migration and improves rural development, smallholder livelihoods and food security in Pacific countries. So the benefits of labour mobility are genuinely reciprocal for both Australia and the Pacific. While I think we would all agree that Pacific labour mobility is an overwhelming success story, we are conscious that, as with any program or scheme, there is always room for improvement for workers, for industry, and for our Pacific and Timor-Leste partners. To this end, I sincerely thank our partners at the Australian National University, the World Bank and the Pacific Labour Facility, who we have an ongoing research arrangement with. And they consistently provide valuable insights into how the scheme is operating, how workers in Pacific countries are benefiting from the scheme, and what we can improve. I also look forward to learning from the experiences of other schemes at today's event. The delivery of a program of the scale of the PALM scheme is not without its challenges, and in recent months you'll all have seen allegations of the mistreatment of workers have emerged. All of these have been thoroughly investigated by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in a timely and effective manner, and we've also referred matters to other agencies such as the Fair Work Ombudsman for consideration and appropriate action where necessary. Robust assurance frameworks are in place to ensure employers are appropriately vetted and comply with Australian workplace relations laws, work health and safety laws, and immigration requirements. We regularly visit accommodation and work sites to check on the welfare of workers, and employers are required to submit regular reports, Steve would probably say too many, to our team to ensure our workers receive adequate financial benefit from their time in Australia. These measures ensure Pacific and Timor-Leste workers are protected from mistreatment. The safety and well-being of Pacific and Timor-Leste workers under the scheme is our highest priority, and our dedicated worker welfare team ensures that worker welfare is at the heart of our approach. We recognise that workers are connected to local communities, and we recognise that workers that are connected to local communities have better wellbeing. So we facilitate connections to community groups and other supports such as churches and sporting groups through important partners, some of whom we see here today. Thank you, Mark and Emma, for coming along. What we're really hoping through that is that workers can build strong relationships that connect them to their communities in their new home. We ensure that workers are briefed on their workplace rights prior to departure and on arrival, and produce information in language on issues that we know are cause for concern for both workers and employers, such as deductions and accommodation. We openly welcome and strongly encourage workers and their advocates to bring forward for investigation concerns around worker welfare directly to the department, to our implementing partner, the Pacific Labour Facility, and or through the PALM support service line, which operates 24 hours, 7 days a week. Any complaint or concern that is brought to us through any mechanism will be closely looked at. Pacific Labour is a success story resulting from strong partnerships between Australia and Pacific nations and Timor-Leste, and the scheme is constantly evolving to respond to Australia's needs and those of our Pacific neighbours. Since September last year, DFAT has been leading a process in close collaboration with other agencies of government in Australia to reform, streamline and consolidate our Pacific labour mobility programs. So while today we'll be focusing largely on seasonal programs, and for Australia that's the seasonal worker program, we also have the longer term Pacific labour scheme, and those programs are now being managed together by DFAT as the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility, or PALM scheme. And we now have a single PALM scheme visa. So that recently introduced visa provides more flexibility to workers and their employers. Workers can now remain in Australia for up to 4 years and can make multiple entries during that time, with the seasonal cohort requiring 3 months offshore each year out of every 12 months. This gives Australian employers better workforce stability and workers more time to develop skills, complete formal qualifications and earn income to send home to their families and communities. Seasonal workers will also be able to move between employers more easily if there are appropriate jobs available to them that cannot be filled by Australians. Recruitment caps have been removed for, or will be removed for, existing employers with a good track record, and we are putting in place more staff who can cover every state and territory to support employers and workers, and removing restrictions on the sectors that are able to recruit seasonal workers, though requirements around a focus in rural and regional Australia will remain. So that means now that all employers with a seasonal workforce needs in rural or regional Australia can now apply to access the scheme. I would also note, though, that we've heard the concerns of some of our Pacific neighbours about the negative social impacts of labour mobility. Family separation and brain drain in particular come to mind. And we're strongly committed to working together with our partners across the Pacific and Timor-Leste to address those concerns. DFAT is genuinely committed to continuously improving the PALM scheme, building capacity to address immediate and long-term workforce shortages, ensure worker protections, and simplifying and improving delivery for industry. To this end, I'm really delighted to be here today to learn about the successes and challenges of seasonal labour programs in other countries. We have much to share and learn from one another, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you to everyone for being here today, and thanks for your time. Thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Carli. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Philip Martin from the Global Migration Centre, University of California, Davis, Professor Emeritus, Agricultural and Resource Economics. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. And I've got a little controller here. So I'm Phil Martin. I actually did some farm work back in my youth. I don't do farm work anymore. And back when I did farm work in the eastern part of the United States, farmers brought in Puerto Ricans who happened to be US citizens, but whose incomes are roughly 1/3 of what the incomes are in the US mainland. And what happened in the island of Puerto Rico is they used to have a lot of sugar mills. The sugar mills closed. A lot of rural people didn't have jobs, and they came seasonally to the United States, or to the mainland part of the United States, to do seasonal farm work. And so it's all seasonal farm worker programs are primarily men. It's typically 80, 90% men. They're often young men. Sometimes away from their families for the first time, and managing migrant seasonal workers far from home is a challenge, I think, everywhere and anywhere. What I'm going to do is focus on some comparisons between, or tell you some stories about how the farm labor system works in the US, but in particularly in California. And the way to sort of think about this is that California is producing horticultural commodities for 325 million Americans in a land area that's about 1/20th the size of Australia. But you'll see that even within California, seasonal farm labor is heavily concentrated. Seasonal farm labor is concentrated in 3 ways in every country: by commodity, by region, and by size of employer. They're interconnected. It's big fruit and vegetable growers in a limited number of areas who employ the most seasonal workers, whether that's domestic or farm. So what are the punchlines that come out of this? So Australia has farm sales of something on the order of 55 billion US dollars, I think, a year. So California's a little less in farm sales than Australia. But what stands out for California is that almost 3/4 of those farm sales are fruits, vegetables, and horticultural specialties. We call them FVH. You call them in Australia horticulture. So for us, horticulture is flowers, potted plants, mushrooms, things like that. For you, horticulture includes fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So California basically is producing fruits and vegetables and other horticultural specialties and then shipping them 72 hours. It's 72 hours by truck from California to New York. And because California is an open-air greenhouse, where it really doesn't rain between April and October, the lettuces produced in California look fresher than the lettuces that come from 2 miles away. And so the whole genius of California agriculture is to have an open-air greenhouse, even though it happens to be distant from most Americans. In order to do that, you need people. The average employment is about 425,000. So about, if you took a snapshot every month, added them up, divided by 12, you get 425,000 people employed in California agriculture. And the comparable thing, as I understand it, for Australia is maybe 135,000 in the horticultural sector. But of course, you need more workers than jobs, and the ratio is roughly 2 to 1. So if I have a year-round job on my strawberry farm, and remember, it's going to be shut down for a few months, I'm going to be hiring 2 workers for each year-round equivalent job. Who are the people? They're not people born in the United States. In California, 90% were born outside the U.S., usually in Mexico, and just as you talk about the difference between working holiday makers and Pacific Islanders, we talk about the difference between unauthorized workers and legal guest workers. The unauthorized are like the working holiday makers. They pay their own way to the U.S., they find their own housing, they make their own way to work. The H-2A, our guest worker program, is just like the Pacific Island. The employer pays for the transportation, the employer pays for the housing and everything else. And of course, the big question is very similar, is how do you substitute legal for, in our case, unauthorized, or what's the balance between working holiday makers? But what happens is that labor costs are rising a lot. And what's been happening, there are 3 responses to it, 3 responses here, 3 responses in Canada, there's a lot more mechanization. There is more mechanization occurring in labor-intensive agriculture now than there's been, at least in the United States, for 30 or 40 years. We have a lot more guest workers, and the whole trick is that the system is evolving to have what we call super labor contractors, people who employ 5,000-10,000 people. They have permanent offices in sending countries. Some of them operate farms in sending countries just to train and select the best workers to bring in the US. So in the United States, we do sports, and we say the H-2A guest workers are the NFL of all pickers. When I study how many bins of apples they pick, so a normal worker in the United States will pick 1,000 bins of apple a day, 4 in a day, so they pick about a half a bin an hour. An H-2A guest worker can do 3/4 of a bin an hour. They're young, they're in the US to work, and they're more productive. And so we are getting these super labor contractors who have permanent offices abroad. They're bringing in trained workers. And then, of course, one thing that you perhaps don't have as much as we do is we import a lot of fruits and vegetables. 60% of the fresh fruit in the US is imported, about 35% of the fresh vegetables, a lot of them come from Mexico. So just so you get a flavor, because in some ways California, of course, is very different from, in other ways it's very similar to, Australia, in the sense that if you look at a map of California, remember it's only 1/20th the size of Australia, but the agriculture is in that red zone. You know, without irrigation, the land isn't worth much. And so when you actually look at how much land is farmed, it's only about 8% of the total land area that's really farmed. And the reason why only 8% is farmed is that's where the water is. If it weren't for the water, the land is very, very inexpensive. And what we're getting is that even though it's not labor intensive, the biggest part of the horticultural sector is nuts, almonds, pistachios, and walnuts. And they have acres and acres of these trees planted. And of course, the irony is people are putting out a lot of money to put in perennial crops without a guaranteed supply of water. And so an even bigger issue than labor in a state like California is what about water? I mean, the California water system is the #1 user of electricity in the world because water is heavy, and we lift. Can you push water uphill? Yes, you can, but it takes an awful lot of energy. And so the whole system is built on snow falling in the winter, melting in the summer and going into dams, and then moved by gravity and by pumps from the northern part of the state to the southern part of the state. So 2/3 of the people live in Southern California, 2/3 of the water is in the north, and moving that water north to south is a huge issue. And a whole lot of people plant perennial crops, especially nuts, without enough water guaranteed. So we have this the big debate in the United States is, how do you assure enough water for irrigated Western agriculture? It's not just California, it's also other places as well. We're talking about huge projects because we have environmental concerns and we have water concerns, but we're here to talk labor. And the way our system works is we divide agriculture into about 35 different sectors. So there's the beef and cattle sector, the dairy sector, the hogs, the poultry. But when you're really talking labor, only 5 count. And the number one sector for labor is what we call crop support. So crop support are non-farm employers who bring workers to farms. And that is by far the biggest sector for employment in California agriculture. Then comes fruits and nuts, then comes vegetables, then comes greenhouses, and then comes dairies. And so for all practical purposes, 5 sectors account for 90% of the wages paid. So beef doesn't really matter. Poultry, eggs. I mean, they do hire workers. There are some big operations, but by and large, it doesn't really matter. And then who are those crop support? Well, you call them labor hire firms. We call them farm labor contractors. So a farm labor contractor is a non-farm entity that brings workers to farms. And in theory, labor contractors should increase efficiency. After all, I'm a seasonal worker. I expect to have 3 or 4 seasonal jobs. Instead of me trying to line up jobs, I let somebody else do it. They take a cut. And by the same token, I'm a small farmer, and I've got a peak seasonal need for 20 or 30 workers. Instead of me doing that, turn it over to a labor contractor, and they should be able to more efficiently bring a crew of worker and get it done. So in theory, labor contracting is a good business. In practice, I mean, it's a plus-plus business. In practice, it tends not to work that way well, and there's a lot of reasons for it, but perhaps the main reason is that the major asset of a farm labor contractor is typically the contacts with employers and contacts with workers. They usually have relatively little bargaining power with employers. So in our system, the way it normally works is the minimum wage is the base wage, and then the contractor gets an overhead on top of that to cover workers' compensation, to cover payroll taxes, pension, et cetera, unemployment insurance, and of course toilets in the field and eventually record keeping. And the norm is about 40%. So whatever the wage is, you've got to add 40%. All of a sudden, we're seeing sometimes labor contractors say, maybe we can do it for 32 or 33. Well, they got to be breaking the law. What they're doing is they don't pay all the payroll taxes, and they count on the fact that the workers aren't going to complain because they know the workers. Sometimes they're their relatives, et cetera. So we get an awful, the question is always, are you increasing efficiency, or are these entities serving as the risk absorbers? Because we have a labor market that's got violations. Where labor contractors are used mostly is in jobs where it's easier to measure output than it is to measure input. So you know there are two rough wage systems in agriculture, hourly and piece rate. There's also salary and stuff, but essentially most jobs are hourly. And you can monitor effort. As an employer, you're always saying a fair day's work, a fair day's pay. You can monitor effort by having, let's say, a working supervisor. So you see a crew of weeders or hoers going through a field, and there's one person who's setting the pace, and that's typically a worker supervisor who's going to get an extra 50 cents or $1 an hour. But if people are climbing trees and picking apples or oranges, it's easier to measure how many bins they pick than it is to measure whether they're really working as fast as they possibly could. So what you do is you set a piece rate. A typical piece rate in the US for picking apples is $25 or $30 to pick a 1,000-pound bin. And you then count the bin. So you count the output, and you make sure that the average worker is going to earn between 15 and 25% more than the minimum wage at an average pace. And that way you will motivate people to work without having to do close supervision. So we normally see a combination of labor contractors and piece rates in tree fruits because there it's more difficult to monitor workers. The largest single employer in the state are strawberry farms. Their average employment is roughly 25,000 So we have about 35,000 acres of strawberries, and the average employment over the year is about 25,000, but remember you need twice as many workers. There's peak seasons and stuff, and so that gives 50,000 workers. The number 2 one is grapes. Average employment's a little lower, but once again, and we have 3 kinds of grapes: table grapes, raisin grapes, and wine grapes. The wine grapes are typically mechanized. And we get vegetables and melons, where the average employment is lower. Part of that is artificial because once a labor contractor brings workers to farms, in our data system, we can't tell what crops they're working in the normal data. But fruits are far more labor intensive than vegetables in general, and the structure of employment is different. We can talk about that. And then we have greenhouse and nurseries that have a fairly high average employment. They tend to have less worker turnover, in part because some of the jobs are year-round. And in the lower, in your lower right corner, you'll know, cannabis is the big growing thing, the emerging new sector. We had an awful lot of flower places, and they were all displaced by imports from Colombia and Ecuador. Those glass houses are still there. They're coming back as growing marijuana. And then we have a very big dairy sector in California that typically operates 24/7, 365. And the normal ratio is somewhere between 75 and 100 cows. Means you need 1 milker. And the biggest dairies are often in the 5,000. I think the biggest single one in the U.S. is around 30,000 cows, but a lot of these are in the 5,000, 6,000 cow range, so they have a lot of milkers. So California is a state in which more workers are brought to crop farms by crop support firms, those labor contractors, that are hired directly. And you can see the gap was growing. We had COVID come in, and it tilted down because the labor contractors are the shock absorbers. You hire them when you need them, you don't hire them when you don't need them. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means for labor contracting firms. They need a lot of capital to ride out ups and downs in the market, and sometimes they don't have that. I've already mentioned the fact that there's a roughly 2-to-1 ratio between workers to jobs. So red is the number of unique people who work for wages on farms in California agriculture, and blue is the number of full-time equivalent jobs. So in a non-seasonal agricultural sector, the 2 lines would be the same. So if this were University of California, the blue jobs would be how many jobs there are, the red would be how many people, and they would be roughly at the same level. There's very little turnover. And so when we look at agriculture, there's both seasonality and turnover. And that really reflects the fact that if you were to take in our data, if you take what an average job should pay and then look at what an average worker gets, there's always a gap. So if you take all the wages that are paid and the average number of jobs, you actually come out with saying the average farm worker earns $30,000 a year. And for 2,000 hours a year, that's $15 an hour. But of course, there is no average worker. And the average earnings of workers is only half that. Why? Well, some of them don't earn as much per hour, but the biggest issue is most of them don't work that many hours. If you look at pay stubs of workers, typically somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 hours a year. So if you're earning, the average hourly wage in the United States is roughly $30 an hour. If you're earning half as much, working half as many hours, you get 1/4 as much an annual income, which is one reason why farm work tends to be an exit labor market. If you don't like it, you tend to get out. Who are the workers? I've already mentioned. They're the heart of the seasonal workforce in the U.S. and especially in California are unauthorized workers who were born in Mexico. They typically came in their 20s, and they came in the 1990s and until the 2008-9 recession. They're now getting older. They tend to be settled in one area, have one employer. That employer could be a labor contractor who moves from one farm to the next. Of course, and I assume the same is true in Australia, the children of seasonal farm workers who are educated in the country don't go into the fields. So if you talk, I've talked to a lot of farm workers and farm work children over the years, people will normally say, this is okay for me, but not for my children. I'm doing this so that they get a better job. So what that means is that the future farm workers to fill seasonal jobs are growing up somewhere outside the US. Right now it happens to be Mexico, but it could well be Central America or Asia or some other place. You can see how much they report earning, et cetera, but I think the main takeaway is for a typical unauthorized worker, And remember, half of them are unauthorized. It's just like farm work is like non-farm work. You don't live on the farm where you work. You commute to work, often you carpool, and you only have one farm employer in the course of the year. And those workers now, because unauthorized Mexico youth migration roughly stopped in 2008, 2009, they're getting older, they're settled down, most of them have US-born children, and that was the story when COVID hit in the spring of 2020. And COVID raised the labor cost because you had to do all kinds of things, like, and remember, agriculture was considered essential, and there were lots and lots of schemes, there were lots and lots of predictions about how crops would not be picked and lettuce would cost $5 a head, et cetera. It didn't happen. I mean, one of the biggest irony, or one of the biggest stories that nobody writes about, is how little COVID there was among farm workers, not how much. All these predictions people made about the losses that were going to happen because there would be nobody to pick the crops didn't happen. There's a lot of arguments that you could make about why it didn't happen. Maybe because the people worked outdoors, maybe because farmers made investments in putting up plastic shields. But the main takeaway is we had far less COVID among workers who were poor, lived in crowded housing, everything than what we expected. There was COVID in the food system, no two ways about it. There was lots of COVID, but where it was in what we call food processing, meat packing, vegetable packing. When you bring workers together, some of these big meat packing plants are running 1,000 or 2,000 people per shift, and they're right next to each other on the so-called disassembly lines cutting up meat. We had lots of COVID there. Cold, wet climates, but those were not farm workers. They were non-farm workers, technically. I mean, that is a non-farm job. And so there was a lot of confusion because many people in food processing are also Hispanic. There were many stories in the media about COVID among farm workers when what they meant was COVID among non-farm workers, but in the food system. So California now has a $15 minimum wage. We have a federal system, so there's a federal minimum wage that applies everywhere, and states have minimum wages. 30 states have minimum wages higher than the federal standard, and so we have now over a 2-to-1 gap between the highest and lowest minimum wages across regions. And with those higher labor costs, we're getting these 3 trends that I'll talk about here briefly, and we can talk then more about the H2A if we want. First is we're getting a lot more mechanization. There's going to be a huge wave of mechanization coming. There's going to be a lot more guest workers, and there will be more imports. The mechanization story is pretty familiar because, after all, the whole story of human history is mechanization in agriculture. And the big real story is that most predictions that it would be hard to mechanize in agriculture, I mean, some of them are true, it is hard to mechanize a lot of things in agriculture, but a whole lot of things that people said could never be mechanized now are. So all the new olive tree plantings are all for mechanical harvesting. The baby carrot story was all based on mechanization, cutting up the carrots. UC Davis did the tomato harvester for processing tomatoes. In the nurseries, they move plants around all the time. And if you talk to the people who do robotics, the main investor in robotics in the United States is the military. And in the military, the idea is performance, not cost. Spend $10 million, save a soldier. In agriculture, it's all about cost, not performance. It doesn't matter if you get every apple in the tree, but you really have to have a durable machine that works day in and day out. And so this little plant thing, the first version of it cost $100,000. It was a great machine, but they needed to strip it down to the basics and get it down to something like $15,000 before the nurseries started buying it. It's all about cost and durability in agriculture. And so that's why when you take a crop like strawberry, the question is, how do you even go about thinking about mechanizing strawberries? You've got this soft, perishable fruit. What's probably going to happen is, so the biggest companies are and what if I didn't say it, I should have said, the big companies that are thinking 10 years ahead are investing in all 3. They're investing in machines, they're investing in housing for guest workers, and they're investing in producing abroad. They're doing all, because standing in 2022, you don't know which is going to succeed, and it's going to succeed differently for different commodities. So in strawberries, as you know, we pick fresh strawberries right into the clamshells in which they're sold, and we have processing or juice berries that just go into a big tray. So clearly workers pick a lot faster when they're picking into big trays than when they're picking into the clamshells that you see. So what will happen is they'll mechanize the packing into clamshells in the packing house first. So the workers will pick faster, and then they'll be put into clamshells in the packing house. And then they'll figure out how to mechanize in the fields. All the experiments to pick individual strawberries, by and large, probably won't work because they do too much damage to the plants as they're growing. The other big thing that's happening is the rise of indoor farming. The amount of venture capital going into indoor farming in the United States is just phenomenal. It's already a big deal in Canada, as we'll hear, in the tomato industry. It's also a huge deal in Mexico. And when you think about this, don't think of glass houses, the most expensive version. Think of just a plastic-covered hoop structure with some perhaps netting at each end to keep out birds and stuff. The yields go way up, the water efficiency goes way up, and you can design automation right into the system from the start. There's also a big spread in mechanical aids. So one of the hardest things to get people to do is to pick from ladders with a bag over your shoulder. It's going to weigh 50 or 60 pounds. So doing this idea of hydraulic lifts, that's a substitute for ladder. These cost about $60,000 each. And what we're actually finding is it's easier to get guest workers to use them than it is to get US workers. A lot of people are used to, I pick my 4 bins at $30 a bin, and I get my $120. But I don't want to share it with you. You might not be as fast as me. And if we're picking on a platform, we've got 4 or 8 people sharing the piece rate at the end of the day. And that's kind of been easier to do with guest workers than it has been to US workers, so we're so used to individual piece rate systems. Our guest worker program is called the H2A program, and it's got a complicated structure, but it's run by 3 agencies: the labor agency, the home affairs or interior agency, and then the visas are issued by the State Department abroad. And you can see the main story is growth. The growth in the number of jobs certified, growth in the number of visas issued. They almost all go to Mexicans. The Mexicans stay in the United States an average 6 months, so there's not that much flying. It's mostly buses, long bus rides. And we are rapidly getting to the point where right now H2As are about 15% of average employment in agriculture. We had a previous program that has a bad reputation called Braceros. At the peak, that was 20%, so we're getting back to where we were in the 1950s. The main thing with the H2A programs, we have 50 states, and there is agriculture in each state, but the 3 states on the West Coast, so-called left side of the United States, California, Oregon, and Washington, they have half of all the hired farm workers in the US. And the way to think about fruit and vegetable agriculture is 2/3 of all Americans live east of Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana. 2/3 of all fruits and vegetables are from west of Utah and Arizona and stuff. So the trick is, how do you grow it one place and ship it 3,000 miles to someplace else? And of course, the trick was to put up the interstate highway systems and have these trucks go and deliver in 72 hours from California to New York. So fruits and vegetables are the yellow and blue. Remember, you can have H2A guest workers in any agricultural commodity so long as it's temporary or seasonal, but fruits and vegetables are where most of the jobs are. And the thing to note is not only are the number of guest worker jobs going up, the role of labor contractors in bringing workers in is going up. So roughly half of the jobs in fruit are with labor contractors. The same is true with vegetables. And here's the real economics of looking at US workers. And remember, when I say US, that means really an unauthorized worker settled in the United States. The H2A workers cost more, but they're younger. So the average unauthorized worker is in his early 40s. The average H2A is high 20s, early 30s. As I said, they're more productive in terms of boxes or bins or anything else. And they provide labor insurance. So a US worker can show up today and not show up tomorrow. An H2A worker, if he or she does not work, they're not allowed to stay legally in the United States. So the real question is, what's that worth? What's the labor insurance worth? If you have a highly perishable commodity, it could be worth a lot. If you have, let's say, citrus, so citrus does not use yet a lot of H2As because they aren't just going to hang on the trees without a lot of damage for a week or so, most times of the year. But strawberries are very perishable, so there the value of labor insurance is more. And then we do something that I don't know if you do. The employers do have to pay for transportation and housing, but they don't pay payroll taxes. So we call Social Security and unemployment insurance a payroll tax. And that's roughly, it's 8% and 8%, 8% employer, 8% employee, and then about 4 or 5% for unemployment insurance. So the H2A workers, yes, they're more expensive because of housing and transit, but they're cheaper in a sense because you save at least 10% on payroll taxes by hiring them. So how does it really work? I mean, the basic idea is, and you might be having, I understand, the same debates here. How do you reconcile the different, we have what I call an iron triangle between the minimum wage, the piece rate, and the productivity standard, okay? So think of it as an equation. The government sets the minimum wage. The employer sets the piece rate. And that automatically defines a productivity standard. I mean, make it simple. Say the minimum wage is $10 an hour, and say the piece rate is $20 a bin to pick apples. Now, what that means is that if I work 8 hours, my employer's got to pay me $80. Let's suppose I only pick 3 bins of apples, so I actually only earned $60. Well, then the employer's got to make up that $20. But there's no rule in any labor law that says if you can't do the job, the employer has to keep you. So in a very infamous case, the Florida sugarcane guys brought workers in. They brought 10,000 workers in to hand cut sugarcane. And they deliberately fired roughly 80, 90 of them at the beginning of every season, because the rest of the workers, many of whom had paid money, they weren't supposed to get there, they saw if you don't work fast enough, you're going home. And that they had figured out, that was the only case I really know about, that they had figured out that they could actually get away with 10,000 workers instead of 13,000 by getting everybody up to speed right away. And so keep in mind that our big story is when we keep raising the minimum wage, but the question is, what should happen to the piece rate? The government is not setting piece rates. The government lets employers set piece rates, and what the government does is try to regulate how piece rates change. And we're getting lots of debates about this because the new apple varieties, they're worth a lot more to the grower, but they bruise easier, and the bruise is often internal, so you don't see it until you cut it open, and then you don't like that apple and stuff. So there's a lot of hassles between this triangle between minimum wages, productivity standards, and piece rates. Because if you raise the minimum wage but keep the piece rate the same, the productivity standard has gone up. There's some people who can do it, some can't. So I already went through that they cost more. We do have a reform pending. It's probably not going to go anywhere, so it's passed a few times. But the basic deal we usually do in agriculture in the United States with ag labor is we legalize the unauthorized people who are already there. We say, it's just too bad, we didn't obey the law, we didn't enforce the law, people came. And now what we're going to do is we're going to legalize, we're going to wipe the slate clean, and then we're going to make it easier for employers to hire legal workers in the future. And the net effect will be no more unauthorized workers. Okay, when I started in this business, I was working in Washington. At that time, we had, say, 20% unauthorized workers in agriculture. Now we have 50%. So it never works. I mean, you don't have just one back operation. You don't have just one legalization. You always have many more. But that's the proposal. What's more likely to happen is this, the most successful labor contractors bringing in guest workers are big operations, typically in the 3,000 to 5,000 worker range. What they want, what I think is doable, is to give them is to let them be certified for multiple years. Don't go through this annual certification. Give the workers multi-year visas, and have them come as a crew ready to go to work, their own supervisors, their own drivers, their own cooks, and take advantage of economies of scale. I mean, the idea of a guy bringing in 10 workers for 8 months and going through all that paperwork and following all that rules, that's pretty hopeless, to be honest. I mean, I do a lot of work on the enforcement side. There are some business models that depend on cheating the workers, but a lot of it is just these are a lot of rules to follow, and a lot of small people can't do it. So the final thing, and then I'll wrap up because I know we're running late here, is you could also do imports. And I know Australia's a long way from a lot of places, and it's important to remember most fresh fruits and if you don't remember anything else, fresh fruits and vegetables are mostly water. Over 90% of the volume of most every tomatoes, they're all over 90% water. So what you're really doing is bringing water and photosynthesis together at one place and sending it somewhere else to be consumed. We happen to have a land border with a big country that has a complementary climate. And so we import most of our fruit and most of our vegetables from Mexico. So 60% of the fresh tomatoes we consume in the US come from Mexico, a couple of percent come from Canada. We bring in avocados, we bring in other things. And so when you look at a country like Mexico, and then you think Morocco is playing the same role for the EU, as you know, of all the cucumbers, for example, they grow in Mexico, 6 out of 10 are being sent up to the United States. There's these big farms in Mexico that are producing exclusively really for the United States. The food safety standards there and the labor standards in many cases are actually higher than they are in the US because the risk of doing it wrong is enormous. You get your crop blocked and the local Mexican market has much, much lower wages. Our ag, probably like your ag, has traditionally been free trade. Ag has always been for free trade, but we're getting some segments of agriculture, especially in the southeastern United States, that are getting very protectionist. So our southeast would probably be more like your Queensland. They're the ones who have to compete with the crops that come from lower wage countries. And so we have a project in Mexico looking at how things work. Mexico's got roughly 3 million hired farm workers. US has about 2.5 million. And of those 3 million hired workers, about 1/4 work on these export farms. And on those export farms, it's a totally different story than it is in producing for the domestic Mexican market. And so the real big thing is, you know, how do you think about development? Do you want people to have the jobs in Mexico, producing there and shipping the stuff to the US? Do you want to bring them as guest workers to the US? Do you want to do both? So the big story in all this is we've got wages going up, we've got these responses, and probably what's most likely to happen is that we're going to get fewer and larger big labor contractors who are able to compete because they get economies of scale in the recruitment and management of seasonal workers. In some cases, that will come quicker. That's happening very fast in some of the fruits and vegetables in California, for example. In other cases, it'll be a little slower. If you want to learn more about this, you can always look on the website that has more, but let me stop there and we can move on to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip. Okay, so now we're going to move online. Just let the tech team set it up. And our next speaker, and apologies that we're running a bit behind schedule to those of you online and in the room. But our next speaker is Robert Falconer. He's Research Associate at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary. And he's going to speak on Canada and the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. That's not Robert, that's me.
Thank you for having me today.
Great.
Can everybody hear me? Can I get a thumbs up there from the front? Perfect. Let me just share my screen here. 1 minute. Okay, and I just throw it in the chat box if you can't see this, but again, first off, thank you very much for the invitation today, especially to Professor Martin for arranging it, and I owe an apology to Professor Curtin for causing me to probably lose a few hairs over the last few days over a tight submission of my slides. But again, thank you for having me today. So what does that mean? As mentioned, I'm a research associate at the University of Calgary. I focus on immigration and refugee policy and a quantitative researcher. And those are the two websites there. In particular, those focused on agriculture may be interested in the one on the right, simpsoncenter.ca, which is a new research division launched at the University of Calgary, specifically focusing on agriculture, agricultural technologies and agricultural labor. Same with Philip. I actually have some practical experience in farming and agriculture here in Canada. I grew up working in the areas in the Okanagan and the East Kootenays of British Columbia, specifically in the cherry industry, where approximately about 35% of all agricultural workers are temporary foreign workers. And I shot in the mill with some of my former colleagues there in that industry. To start us off, when we talk about agricultural immigration and temporary foreign workers in Canada, the Union said there's actually three different programs. One, by and large, dominates the industry. This is SOP, the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. It is a temporary, non-extendable visa for Canada that is specific to a few countries, mostly Mexico, Central America, and participating Caribbean states. There's also
farms. When you take the owners and operators out, they actually comprise about half of all employees or paid laborers in the field. We don't have really good, super good numbers on the number of undocumented workers in the sector. It certainly isn't as big as the United States, as Philip outlined. Some conservative estimates say that for every about 5 legal workers under SOP, there's maybe about 1 undocumented worker. It's not only primary agriculture, though, that we're seeing the growth in the employment of foreign workers, but we're also seeing growth in food manufacturing as well, that's secondary processing of food. This is particularly true in seafood processing in the Atlantic Canada. You can see there the purple bars, that's the share of foreign workers in PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick is quite high. And actually, the federal government just lifted the cap of foreign workers that could be involved in seafood processing just about 2 weeks ago. With Canada at full employment right now, they've also increased the number of months they can stay in Canada from 6 months to 9 months. Now, in addressing the structure of the seasonal agricultural worker program, I think it's really important to ask the question, how did we get here? Where did the SOP program come from, and why does that question even matter? And I think it's important that we answer that because it really defines how SOP is governed and what its objectives are and why the program is structured in the way that it is. It also will define how we improve the program in the future and how we address issues when they arise. So for most of Canadian history up until the Second World War, most of our immigration was agricultural immigration. I mean, there was mostly farmers and farm laborers that were moving to Canada. The figure on the left shows just raw numbers of workers in the hundreds of in the thousands coming to Canada each year, and really up until the Great Depression era, more than 50% of all immigration to Canada was agricultural based. There was a brief blip after the war, but many of these were actually just an attempt by the federal government to push urbanized European refugees into the agricultural sector, and many of these did not actually end up staying in that sector. So why did agricultural immigration to Canada stop? Was it just a matter of urbanization and there were no more prospective immigrant farmers? It's an interesting question. One possible answer, and one that I'm actually coming around to thinking is probably the likely one, is the increasing power of subnational governments in Canada. Canada, like Australia, is a federal government system where there's a division of powers and budgets between the federal government at the national level and subnational governments called provinces. Now, between 1872 and 1931, the federal government really heavily subsidized the purchase of land, farming, capital investment on farms, travel to Canada by farmers, and the training of agriculturalists on the Canadian climate and Canadian farming techniques under a piece of legislation that was called the Dominion Lands Act, which famously, like the Homestead Act, gave new settlers 160 acres of land for free and the right of first refusal to buy adjoining plots to that land. But something happened in 1931, and I'm not talking about the Great Depression. In 1931, the Canadian government actually turned almost all of its jurisdiction over these lands to provincial governments, who, with far more limited budgets and far more limited powers over immigration, quickly eliminated the subsidies and the subsidized land purchases and capitalization of these farms. This figure here is something I'm working on. It's very preliminary. But the blue line shows the decline of new immigrant farmers, or the trending decline of new immigrant farmers to Canada following the transition of Dominion lands under the federal government to subnational governments. Now, you might be asking, what about the effects of the Great Depression and World War II? Obviously, with the world in a depression and with U-boats crossing the Atlantic, there's going to be much more limited immigration. And while these are, I think, considerations and factors, I'm actually working on a paper right now with new data that suggests that these might not have had lasting effects on the arrival of new farmers to Canada were it not for this transition from federally subsidized farm immigration to the provincial governments. And the reason for this is that actually the Dominion Lands Act actually still exists today. Specifically in those 3 northern territories you see there at the top of the map, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. These territories are a different type of subnational government than the provinces in the south, and they're actually still under the supervision of the federal government. They have some limited powers in territorial legislatures, but actually the Dominion Lands Act still exists there, and you actually can still access the same number of subsidies and the same free land in those areas. Now, of course, there's not much farming typically going on up there. This picture to the right is of my father, who lives in Nunavut. And as you can see in the background iceberg there, there's not particularly good arable farmland, good fishing, but not a whole lot of other agricultural going on. But there is an exception to the territory furthest to the left there, furthest to the west, the Yukon. There are arable parts of the territories, particularly in the Yukon. This is a picture of a farm up there. Of course, opportunities to farm are limited. Um, and I really wish I did a good plot to show you right now, but I'm still actually in the process of cleaning and exploring this data. But for a high level set of numbers, in 2016, there was actually about 30,000 acres of farmland in Yukon. Not substantive, certainly nothing compared to what's going on in the rest of Canada, but there was a good amount of activity up there in the form of growing oats, hay, and a small amount of fruits, berries, and nuts and greenhouse activities. And by the way, that 30,000 of acres is actually an increase of about 8,000 acres over 10 years. And actually has been a pretty steady increase since the post-war era, where in the post-war era, there was only about 100 acres of active farmland in the Yukon, and it's gone up to about that 30,000. And I think this is probably the strongest evidence to date that it was really, again, that we chose in Canada to stop subsidizing the immigration of agriculturalists to Canada. Effectively closing off that pipeline of the creation of new farmland and the creation of new farmers. It still goes on to this day in a limited form in the Yukon, which again, I think is the counterfactual here. So what's the effect of this? Now, we've effectively shut off the pipeline of new farmers, but at the end of the war, brought about a massive decline in the number of farmers and owners and operators, along with their unpaid family members. This figure here, by the way, shows the domestic workforce in agriculture by class of worker, and that those really sharp declines in red and purple show the drop in owners operators and the drop in unpaid family members of those owners and operators. As I mentioned, we effectively shut off the pipeline to bringing new agriculturalists to Canada. But after the war, through the Veterans Rehabilitation Program, we really lit the fire under the process of urbanization already happening. The Veterans Rehabilitation Act specifically facilitated the exit of farmers who didn't want to farm. It gave them generous grants to build homes in the suburbs around Canadian cities, but it also helped farmers who wanted to stay receive grants to purchase the farms and equipment for those farms of exiting farmers. So basically, the leavers, the ones who want to leave the farms, were given a financialized out to move to the cities, and the remainers who remained on the farms were given the grants to purchase up all the remaining land. As for the employed workforce, that blue line there, it's actually remained remarkably stable throughout this period, and it's actually even grown in proportion to owners and operators. Now, as a result, you have this massive collapse in the number of farms, the farms here being the blue line. The number of farms in Canada that are independently owned has significantly dropped. The number of acres under cultivation has declined slightly as well, but overall not as much. So what this really tells us that there's just been this massive consolidation of farms in Canada. You have fewer owners and operators owning much larger tracts of land in Canada. As you can see here, farmers can mechanize, but the distribution by sector is uneven, and sometimes mechanization isn't happening enough to sustain output. So really the number of acres covered by each worker is increasing. And that red dot there at the top is from the latest farm census in 2016, showing the number of acres having to be covered by workers. It is increasing substantially with the decrease in the number of farms across Canada. Now, of course, there are fewer farmers having to manage bigger farms, and one response to this has been really to raise wages to try to attract workers to those farms to help them out. The orange line here is the rise of real dollars, in real terms, monthly wages since 1946 to the last date I have is in 2019. Currently, the average wage rate for workers in Canadian agriculture, in primary agriculture, is between $22 to $25 an hour, and that's in Canadian dollars, even as the domestic labor pool has shrunk. The other response, of course, aside from raising wages in the hopes of attracting workers, is to mechanize. Farm mechanization has also increased, relatively speaking, during this time. Farms are investing in new technologies regularly, but the domestic response to wages has still remained rather lackluster. And this is where we enter the TFW program. So that blue line again shows the number of permanent agriculturalists moving to Canada. Started in the mid-1960s, we saw the introduction of this TFWs, the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. Late 80s, that program, which was initially capped, had its cap removed, and ever since then we've seen a very significant year-over-year increase in the number of seasonal agricultural workers coming to Canada. As mentioned, the domestic proportion of employees has remained relatively steady over this time, or has even increased in proportion to the decline of other workers, particularly again those owners and operators and unpaid family members. But foreign workers are very quickly catching up. Where as of right now, and I'm sorry, I'm just trying to move my little sidebar here. As of right now, TFWs and domestic workers together comprise about roughly, give or take 50% of the entire workforce when you include owners and operators, but certainly a majority together. Now, one explanation for this is when we go back here is that even with the rise in wages over this period, the number of domestic workers, again, these are domestic employees, remain relatively flat, even in response to the rise in wages. But this has not been the case for seasonal agricultural workers, who have responded quite positively to the rise in wages during this time. Best data that we have shows that for every 1% increase in wages over the past number of years has yielded about a 7% increase in workers over the past while. And this is, again, we can argue that this is a genuine market response to the rise in wages because, again, seasonal agricultural workers are not capped. There is no limitation on the number of workers a farmer can hire for their outfit, so long as they try to show that they've put good faith efforts into hiring domestic workers first. So SOP specifics. The SOP specifically is administered jointly by two federal agencies. It's administered first by Employment and Social Development Canada. They're in charge of assessing the labor market impact of foreign workers. Going back to this slide here, even though there is no cap on seasonal agricultural workers, the Canadian government does have to do an assessment first about whether or not they would outcompete domestic workers for what specifically was called the prevailing wage rate in a region. The prevailing wage rate is not the same as the minimum wage. So the employer can't just offer minimum wage to these workers. They have to offer what they see as the average wage rate in that region, which is often quite higher than a minimum wage. As mentioned before, the average wage rate for much of Canada is about between $20 to $25 per hour for each worker. Now, that's one federal agency that administers the labor market. The other agency is Immigrant, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, which is our primary Ministry of Immigration. Once Employment and Social Development Canada conducts this labor market impact assessment, they will then give an approval to an employer to hire a seasonal agricultural worker. Then once Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada sees that, they are then authorized to give that worker a work permit and a visa to come to Canada. Now, there is no formal role in administering the program at the provincial level, but there is a role by the provincial ministries of labor who enforce health and safety laws. So oftentimes there is this informal consultation that's going on between the provinces and the federal government. So provinces will often do inspections of these facilities. They'll receive complaints by workers who are abused or perhaps trafficked. And oftentimes those provincial ministries do have, albeit in an informal role, a strong say going to the federal government to say blacklist an employer. If an employer is abusing, if there's substantial evidence of systemic abuse on a farm and a provincial ministry of labor finds out about it, they can actually then communicate that with the federal government, who can then blacklist that employer going forward and impose their own fines along with the fines allowed by the federal government as well. So those agencies that are either in charge in administering the program or are involved, SOP is an employer-specific program, meaning that a worker cannot just come up and legally work for any employer. They're only allowed to work for the employer that is written on their work permit. There is no transfer allowed between them. You can transfer farms. So, for example, if a employer owns multiple farms, workers are allowed to move in between those multiple outfits. Now, that said, I know this anecdotally, and I've seen it firsthand. when there are large family outfits that are legally separate entities, it is perhaps not unsurprising that there is often an informal transfer between farms where employees will move, seasonal workers will often move between these various family-owned farms, which again are independent outfits and will help each other out in getting the crop in. SOP is also limited to a national commodity list. If you go and Google that with the SOP program, it'll give you a list of approved agricultural industries. And most importantly here, as mentioned at the top of the presentation, there is no path to permanent residency. So there is no program for these workers to become permanent residents in Canada with a pathway to citizenship. They receive an 8-month non-extendable permit. Now, what do I mean by non-extendable? What that means that at the end of the season, the worker has to go back to their home country, whether it be Mexico, Jamaica, or Guatemala, or one of the other SOP states. They can come back next year, but there is no mechanism for them to stay in Canada and actually renew their permit from within the country. They have to leave and then access a wholly new permit. Employers must provide and pay for transportation to Canada, so airfare. They have to provide inspected housing, meaning housing that meets the standard of the foreign governments that are involved. And they also provide some sort of means of day-to-day transportation to employees, so they can go do shopping, go into town, especially if there's in a rural area. These are all conditions of the program. As mentioned before, wages have to be set to the prevailing wage for an area, which again is the average wage for that particular industry. Or if there is a unionized outfit, a unionized farm, they have to pay the wage established under the collective agreement on that farm. SOP has the highest retention rate out of any other temporary foreign worker program in Canada. What I mean by retention is workers who try to return year after year. Data from Statistics Canada suggests that after 10 years, approximately 20% of workers from a year one cohort are actually still there. And this is compared to less than 1% in other industries. So in other industries, when you have a cohort of workers arrive to work in that industry after 10 years, only about 1% of them are remaining in that particular, without a particular employer. But for SOP, 20% of that year one cohort will still be there. And of course, there's a decline over the years, but it's not, by and large, there's workers continue to return year after year. So SOP specifics continued. Until recently, employers had to prioritize advertising to domestic workers for a minimum of 14 calendar days in a 3-month period before seeking a foreign worker. This has been recently suspended. But what I meant by this is that in the 3 months before an employer seeks out a seasonal worker, they had to advertise the job for 2 weeks. They had to advertise and recognize newspapers, employment sites, employment centers, and other media. Then they had to show proof of their recruitment efforts to really show that they tried to find a domestic worker. Again, as mentioned, this is recently suspended. So actually, with a tight labor market in Canada right now, the government has waived those advertising rules. The employer must then apply for that labor market impact assessment and receive a positive assessment from the ESDC. That labor market impact assessment is, again, ESDC really conducting a review of the area and see if the employer has done some good faith efforts to really recruit domestic workers. ESDC still does that, even though the efforts of the employer themselves have recently been suspended. And that labor market impact assessment must be sent to the foreign government's Ministry of Labor. So the Mexican government, the Guatemalan government, Jamaican government, et cetera. There is no cost, and this is perhaps some differentiation between Canada, Australia, and the US. There's no cost to the employer for conducting LMIA, so the employer can request that at no cost to them. The processing time is 14 days under SOP, and this is perhaps one attractive feature of the program, is that you can actually apply for and receive one of these assessments in 2 weeks after applying for it. And it's 28 days for other agricultural streams. So it's actually a relatively low cost or no cost program that is pretty fast response time by the federal government for getting back to the employer. Similarities and differences to the US. Some differences are that, unlike the US, most SOP employees tend to live on the farm or near the farm. They wake up and walk right into the workplace. They are also mostly documented, and there are indications that it's intergenerational because most of these workers return to their home country at the end of the season. It's not uncommon to see a father, for example, bring along a son after a number of years when they grow up. Similarities, it is concentrated in vegetable and melon farming, fruit and tree nut, and greenhouse. There is some limited animal agriculture, It's not much. Hog farming, for example, only 5% of all workers in that industry are represented by seasonal agricultural workers. Of course, this differs when you look at food manufacturing. And high mechanization tends to complement guest workers. Actually, it doesn't. There's not much indication that it's displacing guest workers, but it might displace domestic workers. As Philip mentioned, here too in Canada, we actually saw a very limited impact of COVID-19 in the field. Best estimates that we have is that only in the mid 10s, so we're talking about between 15 to 20 or so seasonal agriculture workers were passed away due to COVID-19 over the past couple of years. Where we did see a big impact of COVID-19 was actually, again, in food manufacturing, so in the meat packing and fruit packing plants themselves. So it's SOP the gold standard, and we're coming up here on the end of my presentation. It's often regarded as such. I've seen that tossed around quite a bit in literature on the subject. There is a strong ability for ESDC to blacklist employers. Inspections are conducted by participating consulates in the federal government. At the same time, there's very little quantitative evidence supporting the quality of the program. There's actually not been a whole lot of research done in this area that actually puts specific numbers to the quality of program or the metrics whereby you could say that that is a good program. But there is plenty of qualitative research that suggests that while BERT workers benefit significantly from being able to send remittances home, living conditions and unreasonable hours are particular and recurring issues. Last couple slides. There are recourses for workers. They can go to the provincial labor ministry as mentioned, and that provincial labor ministry can recommend the issuance of a new work permit, allowing them to move to a different employer or even completely change industries totally if there is significant abuse. There are unions if they are available, but coverage is spotty. There is not universal collective agreements across the sector. Consulates is an interesting one because consulates oftentimes, despite ostensibly being on the side of the worker, being from their country, oftentimes are more interested in maintaining employer-employee relations. In their view, the consulate and Yukon are concerned saying, well, we might have one bad worker with one bad experience, but if we burn the employer, that could represent a loss of hundreds of jobs. So oftentimes actually consulates are seen among workers as actually being not so much a friend and more adversarial and wanting to maintain that employer relationship. There are federal agencies, as mentioned, and there are nonprofit and advocacy groups. And these groups often function with government funding, so may actually act as a de facto government agency pushing reform. And they can, again, recommend workers to these provincial labor ministries. Final questions, and this is the last part of my presentation. Should workers have a right to PR? These are questions being explored in Canada. On the one hand, a right to permanent residency in Canada might harken back to our tradition of agricultural immigration to Canada, but it might also provide additional incentives for workers to put up with abuses by employers. If an employer can dangle permanent residency over the head of a worker, what might a worker be willing to put up with in order to gain a chance to a golden ticket to residency in Canada? I don't have the answer to that question, but I think it's there are multiple sides to that. And while advocates tend to favor a right to permanent residency in Canada, an opportunity to move here, I don't think we can just necessarily ignore the question of what might workers put up with if there's an opportunity for the equivalent of a green card in Canada. What is the role of collective agreements? Should we unionize? Should be pushing for more unionized work on the fields? Many workers actually don't necessarily favor unionization because it can add fees to their limited amount of remittances they're able to send home. Should SOP continue? Should we let mechanization reign, or should we seek for more food imports? I'll say the answer to that last one is that there is serious conversations going on in the federal government right now to the extent of how can Canada be a breadbasket to the world with food exports, especially with the conflict in Ukraine. So my suspicion is that SOP will continue and will continue rationing up because even a brief dip in productivity to perhaps say favor mechanization, I don't think is in the cards right now. Neither is importation. I'm happy to entertain questions via email, and that's it for my presentation. But I hope the history of SOP has given you some insight. Why do we have SOP in the first place? And the answer to that is we stopped subsidizing the immigration of permanent agriculturalists to Canada, and we provided an out to agriculturalists who are leaving the sector. So we stopped the pipeline going in, and we provided a very fast out to agriculturalists. And so with a decreasing agricultural workforce, we are going to have to take seriously this consideration. Do we substitute for more capitalization and mechanization on farms, or do we look for workers abroad or within Canada? Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thanks so much, Robert. We appreciate that you're joining us from the evening in Canada. And to both Philip and yourself, there's a lot of content to get through on these programs in quite a limited amount of time. So we really appreciate you doing your best to get as much content out there within that space. Unfortunately, we've had challenges connecting to Manjula Luthria from the World Bank, so we won't be able to have her respondent session next. The one upside is that means we're on time, so we can take a break now. For those of you who are joining us online, please, in parallel, go and grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee and some morning tea. And we're planning to keep to schedule and rejoin at 10:55 a.m. Canberra time. And for those of you online, we will pause the Zoom, so you can just rejoin using the same link. Thanks to everyone, and just another reminder to enter any questions in the Q&A. We'll see you again in 20 minutes. Thank you.